You're listening to Let's Talk Creation, the science podcast that's just for you.
Now, Craig is really careful here. He wants to say, look, I don't have an anti-supernaturalist bias.
Right. Because he'll accept miracle. That's really bizarre about the whole thing. He'll say certain things are miracles, and so that's not really open to examination. But this is not a miracle, and so it's clearly ludicrous.
Yeah.
Which is very strange.
Yeah, so do we have reasons, Hans, do you think, to be somewhat skeptical of that claim of not having an anti-supernaturalist bias? Because, I guess we have to remember that, Craig is a 21st century man, and he's operating within a context where the dominant kind of paradigm, the dominant worldview is this materialistic scientific worldview.
Right.
And he seems to have a problem with elements in the text that stand in stark contrast when we hold them against that backdrop of the scientific materialist worldview.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, a couple of points. Like, one is in the, I forget if it's in the introduction to the book or chapter 1, but early on in the book, he says methodologically, the chapters on biblical and theological themes, he's going to focus on internal questions in the text, and he's going to set aside science. I mean, he actually emphasizes that precisely because he doesn't want to fall into the type of science sort of coming in through the back door and exercising or shaping the way he interprets scripture. So I appreciated that. But then when we get to the fantastic elements, it seemed to me that the only reason he judges them to be fantastic in the way that he defines them is just because it's not plausible in our sort of scientific mindset or given our cultural assumptions. So I was wondering if he was being consistent to what he set out to do. So that's the first point. And then secondly, in terms of the anti-supernaturalist bias, in terms of, we want to read him charitably. And so as Todd was alluding, he does actually explicitly say, I am not anti-supernaturalist. And I believe in miracles, etc. So I want to acknowledge that. But then when one of the fantastic elements that he mentions is the fact that there were cherubim with a flaming sword. So he does actually elaborate on that. And then when you look at the argument he gives, he says it's something to this effect. Well, Israelites would never sort of depict something something from the heavenlies or from the heavens because they had an explicit commandment from God that they're not supposed to worship heavenly realities. But then in the Genesis account, we actually see them depicting cherubim outside the Garden of Eden. So Craig says it must be the case that they didn't believe those were real, because if they believed they were real, then they would have been going against the commandment. So that's something like his reasoning. And I just thought, I was a little surprised because that just didn't have the same kind of analytic rigor that he has in other parts of the book. And I thought, well, that's interesting because it does, in Exodus, it's actually what God says is you're not supposed to worship anything in the heavens, on the earth, or under the earth. So I mean, it's a pretty universal commandment. But the key is you're not supposed to worship these elements. But there's nothing in the commandment that says you can't depict them, or you can't even sort of create an object for some other purpose other than worship. And I've interacted with Craig on this, and I pointed out that in Exodus and in First Kings and elsewhere, you see the Israelites physically representing objects and creatures. For instance, in the temple, you have pomegranates, you have the sea being depicted, and you have bulls, like animals being depicted in Solomon's temple. And there's no sense that there was anything wrong with that. And the point is, those weren't worshipped. Whereas when Israelites depicted the golden calf, that was idolatry, because that was in the context of worship. So all of that, all his argumentation for why he thought the cherubim couldn't be historical or literal or real, just actually, upon closer scrutiny, it just didn't seem plausible. And then, which then raises the question, what's really going on here? What's actually motivating this objection? And I think personal incredulity was actually the best answer I could come up with. And I don't say that to be, I don't want to be dismissive of Craig, but it's just hard not to see that as the only viable, the only viable thing that's happening behind the scenes.
You've just heard a clip from the Let's Talk Creation podcast. If you want to check out full episodes, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And if you want to check out other streaming options, visit us at coresci.org/podcast. That's coresci.org/podcast.